Good morning, everyone. Bom dia a todos. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Emeran Mayer to our session at the Institute for Advanced Studies at USP. Dr. Mayer is a world-renowned gastroenterologist, neuroscientist, and professor at UCLA at Davis, where he serves in the departments of medicine, psychology, and psychiatry. Dr. Mayer is the author of several acclaimed books, including The Mind-Gut Connection and The Gut-Immune Connection, and strong advocate of the One Health concept, which connects individual, environment, and planetary health. His interdisciplinary vision brings together science, clinical practice, and traditional knowledge, offering a unique perspective on the role of food, culture, and microbiota in emotional and cognitive health. We are truly privileged to hear from him today. Thank you so much for being here with us.
A message for those who are watching us from home or the office, that those who have questions, please send the question to the email iaresponde@usp.br, iaresponda@usp.br.
Can you take a couple of pictures also? Yeah, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me to come here. And I'm glad I was able to add this to my visit at Fortaleza, which was a great meeting, as much as I could tell from. So the topic that Elizabeth selected, it's similar to one of the talks that I gave at the meeting in Fortaleza. And I have to admit, it's something that's not my main research area. So, the cultural basis of eating is, for me, was always the neurophysiological basis of eating and the gut basis of eating, but not the cultural. But it's, as you'll see, I found it very, very interesting to actually look into this literature and it made me really appreciate that cultural dimension, how important that is definitely for practicing dietitians and people that recommend diets or want to change, as many of us want to change the bad habits of eating that's so prevalent. Certainly in the US, I don't know about it's probably not as bad in Brazil, but certainly in the US it's a major crisis, and not only it doesn't stay in the US, it's being exported all over the world, and wherever it goes, the export would find the same kind of health consequences, negative health consequences. Companies that I'm on the external medical advisory board, most of these companies, they just have an interest to put your name and your headshot on their website, and then you're no longer involved with them. That's true about many of them, with the exception of some of them. Like, for example, I do want to emphasize this Eat Real company by Nora Latorre, who's the CEO. That's an amazing organization that has basically is taking healthy nutrition into the school system, into the school cafeterias. And this organization has reached 1 million children already changing their dietary habits. And it's not just changing the children's habits, but also their mothers. So that's a company that I'm involved in more than with some of the others. God, I'm not good at this. Okay. So there's a lot of topics that I came up with when you look into the cultural influence of or the cultural variations of food. Just less so on the microbiome studies, obviously, But here's just some of the key points that I want to touch upon: evolutionary and anthropological foundations, culture and taste preferences, that's an interesting one, mealtime structures, social norms, and then gut microbiome 101, culture in the gut microbiome, and yeah, food symbolism and identity. So there's a lot of dimensions to this topic. I find each of them really interesting, and hopefully I can convince you that you feel the same way. So human dietary patterns, obviously we know a lot how they're shaped by biological needs. They're pretty universal, these biological needs. It's essentially to get enough fuel into our bodies to run our metabolism, to run our major functions. But there's also these cultural influences that sometimes play even as important an effect as in what a group of people or a country actually eats. Equally important to the needs of the body that sort of are underlying all of these. As I said, I mean, the physiological requirements for energy and nutrients are universal. The foods people eat and how, when, and why they eat them, which is also very important for our recommendations, the dietary recommendations. They vary widely across societies in different geographical regions. And you may get the impression that there's different biological needs from all these different parts of the world, but the biological needs are fairly constant. Our human bodies are not that different from, and brains are not that different in different parts of the world. So cultural determined eating habits. As I said, that they dictate not only what people eat, the macronutrients, but also when, where, and with whom. And with whom, I want to emphasize that it's an important component. The structured meal times, 3 meals a day, family dinners are typical in Western cultures, but less rigid in others. In Mediterranean cultures, lunch is the largest meal. In many Asian cultures, breakfast may be the most substantial. And it's kind of interesting because various influencers and food gurus, trying to introduce new patterns of when you should eat and like the time-restricted eating. These are all basically variations on a theme that on the planet at large have been played out and have been decided based on cultural norms. And I think one of the most important points is this commensality, shared eating. So it reinforces group identity and social bonds. And research has shown that eating in groups is associated with healthier food choices and better psychosocial outcomes. It may be one of the major components of the Mediterranean lifestyle. So we always talk about the Mediterranean diet. Yes, it's healthy from its components. But I always use the example, come back to this later, my own experience in different regions of Italy where the food is actually very different, but the lifestyle is the same, and it's always the same. I think you have some of that here in Brazil, socializing over food and having a good time and being happy, not worrying if it's gluten-free or if there's something in it that you have to worry about. This is another one that's important to realize. So cultural determined eating habits, symbolism, and religion. Different cultures construct distinct systems for classifying food, often based not on the components, the macronutrients, but often based on symbolic or health-related criteria. So for example, humoral system based on hot and cold or wet and dry plays a big role in, for example, this hot and cold in India, in the Ayurvedic tradition that basically classify each of the food items in terms of hot and cold. Also, it's a big part of the traditional Chinese medical system. And these classifications may influence dietary compliance, health behaviors, and interpretation of illness. How much truth or scientific evidence there is to support these classification systems, I don't think we really know. I mean, this hot and cold in India is so prevalent, but I don't think anybody's ever done scientific studies to figure out if there's really a scientific basis to it. There's another one, concepts of clean versus unclean, or permitted versus forbidden. That's really applies to these religious dietary laws. So kosher is a big one, halal is another one, vegetarianism. And they are major factors that shape what people eat and how they feel about what they eat. Do they feel, if they break some of these laws, these religious laws, do they feel bad about that? Does it have a negative effect on their overall health? So taste preferences. I've talked to Marcus about this, and I've had exchanges back and forth about just the texture, the texture of pasta, for example, which is very different and seems to be different in Brazil than it is in Italy. Italians, it's a religion that it has to be half cooked, it has to be al dente, whereas here seems to be the soft preference. Same with salt preferences and sweet preferences. So clearly in the US, there's a very high preference for sweet things, and that's same in Mexico. My early impressions or superficial impressions here in Brazil seems to be similar, not as bad as in the US. But for example, companies like Danone, their yogurts, if you eat them in Europe, in the US, and in Brazil, they're totally different sweet categories. Then something similar has to do with, fermented foods. So very popular in many parts of the world, certainly in Asian cultures, fermented foods are an essential part of the cuisine. And we'll come back to this, why fermented foods are so popular in many parts, and probably with the majority of people. But they have not been that popular in the US, so it's taken major marketing efforts to introduce naturally fermented foods like kimchi and kombucha in the US, and also with yogurts. One of the lowest consumption of yogurts in the US compared to Europe, Scandinavia. And a very important thing about this programming of taste preferences, it happens early in life. It happens in the first few years of life. And once that's programmed, it will pretty much stay with that individual for the rest of life. It's manageable, so you can actually, with a conscious effort, wean yourself off sugar, and then you're kind of shocked when you then drink, have drinks and see how overly sweet they are. But it does take a conscious effort to reverse what's programmed early in life. So I think the taste preferences could be a big obstacle in moving away from unhealthy foods, and from many aspects of ultra-processed foods, and it almost has to start in childhood. It's much more difficult to do this later on in life, and the non-nutritive sweeteners are definitely not a solution to this, because they have unhealthy effects on metabolism and on the microbiome. So they're somewhat better, and there's a range of qualities in this market, with the natural ones, stevia, being probably the better ones, and the chemical ones like sucralose probably being some of the worst. So the evolutionary reasons for cultural food diversity, this is the unique ability of humans to been able to adapt to diverse environments and food sources, which was critical for human survival. So when our ancestors moved out of Africa, obviously they had to adapt to totally different food components and develop different food preferences in these new geographical locations. And then a very important aspect in the influence of culture on food is the evolution of the development of cooking. This has had a major effect, not just on the actual food, but also cooking became sort of the focus of the social interactions around the cooked meal, much more than foraging in the forest. And same with food sharing. This emerged early in human history and allowed for greater dietary flexibility and social cohesion. So it's kind of interesting how things like cooking and fermentation all had these impacts on what people actually ate and what they. So you would think we're, as humans, genetically we're fairly similar, so we can assimilate and digest and absorb the same kind of foods, but these other factors have played a major role in changing our habits. Part of this is, I'll come to this in the second half of the talk, has to do with the microbiome. Our genes are very inflexible. It takes about 8,000 years before the genes adapt to a new situation. So this wouldn't have been that helpful with people moving to different areas of the planet over a short period of time. But the microbiome is very good in adapting rapidly. Within 48 hours, microbes can adapt to a completely different diet in a different area. So the fact that cultural influences were so important is because we have a system in us that can adapt to these cultural changes, even though the amount of macronutrients that we're consuming has sort of stayed somewhat the same. And this kind of goes further to think about the anthropological diet functions. So food functions as a central component of people's identity, kinship, and religion. So in the modern world, this is mainly national identity. Obviously, Italians totally identify with their food. I guess Brazilians probably have a similar thing. Even the US, who doesn't really have a food culture, identifies with hamburgers and French fries. And with religion, as I said earlier, these important guidelines and restrictions imposed by various world religions have sort of a major influence of, or closely related to these food preferences. And there's another interesting thing about cooking. So I like this language. Cooking transforms nature into culture, and turning raw ingredients into socially meaningful meals. So everywhere you can grow the same vegetables, but the actual meal is something totally different. It's not only to do with what vegetable this is, but it's really what meaningful social connection this vegetable gets in the context of a national or a particular group of humans that stick to a certain definition of these meals. So I mentioned this to several people. It was sort of really one of my major formative experiences in when I was in early stage of medical school, that I had the opportunity to participate in a documentary film expedition by a wealthy businessman in my hometown. And so for 2 months, so this was the privilege in the German medical school at the time, you had these long semester breaks. The whole thing took 6 years, obviously, but the good thing was you had these long semester breaks where you could do. Nowadays, people do volunteering and getting professional experience. We did it at our time, to get some amazing experiences. So this was one of them. And sadly, I didn't really have much medical or scientific background. We lived with these people. We basically canoed up the Orinoco River almost to the spring, to the headwaters of it, and which was an amazing adventure. But then at the end, we actually ended up with these villages of uncontacted indigenous people. And when we arrived, they put us up in one of these hammocks right in the middle of the family. So we were direct witnesses to anything that went on in this family, from from interacting with their children to having sex amongst each other, obviously not with us, but and it gave us a very good insight. So in retrospect, I reconstructed how people live and what they eat, and it's definitely it's one of the remnants of the hunter-gatherers, one of the few remnants. There's the Hatstas in East Africa, a dwindling group of people that are probably going to disappear in the next 50 years. I think the Yanomami have pretty much, in this form, that has pretty much disappeared as well. They now live in huts, no longer in this Shabono structure this communal structure. But one thing was clear, that they're even though they have a completely different culture from anything that we're used to. I always say it was like going to another planet, both in terms of communication and facial expressions and emotional expressions. But if you look at actually what they ate and what their culture determined, what's good for them, it's like the standard or the default ancestral diet with lots of fruits and vegetables. The women went out into the forest every day, spent the whole day in the forest collecting tubers and berries and fruits from wild plants. And the men went hunting or fishing. And it was interesting to see that this kind of dietary pattern. So people have studied. So many of them die relatively young, in their 40s. But that's from complications not related to their health. It's so the men die in warfare because they constantly attack other villages to rob women from other villages. So if they're not eaten by a crocodile or bitten by a snake, they live into the mid to late 80s without any medication. So clearly you can see that this, like 95% of human history, people were used to this kind of diet in different variations. There were cultural variations, but the basics of that diet has always been the same. Until basically we changed it in dramatically with agriculture, and then in the last 100 years with all the changes that have happened in the US and in Europe. Another tradition deeply ingrained is fermented food. So when I was traveling in Korea, I was fortunate to have somebody who guided us through different aspects of Korean villages and towns. And so this was a meal that we ordered in a small town. And I forgot what the main dish was that we ordered, but all the other dishes came with as side dishes, and they were all fermented, different kinds of things, from fish to meat to vegetable to pasta, and it's something that they, the taste preference of their children are programmed for that as well. Because I asked several people, "Do you eat this kind of food? Do you give this kind of food to their young children?" And said, "Yes, absolutely. They grow up with this." The paradox is, and this is something that I always try to sort of be objective. So you could say this is like the healthiest, dietary cultural habit. But if you look at their Alzheimer's disease rates, they have skyrocketing. They have some of the highest rates in. So this food that we say, you know, fermented foods and plant-based foods that we know or we propagate as being the healthiest food for gut-brain interactions, in the real world, it's not. It doesn't show that same effect. Most likely because there's multiple other factors that contribute to it. But I found several examples of that, where you look at a dietary habit, cultural determined dietary habit, and you think this got to be the healthiest population, but they're not. So so diet is one part of it, and this is definitely an amazing example of how fermented foods they have a unique gut microbiome, but it's not reflected in the optimal health and healthy longevity that other countries in the world have. So this is sort of one of the most amazing things. So over 95% of human history, the basic components of what I call the default diet have pretty much stayed the same, and it was always, you know, predominantly plant-based, little red meat, meat coming mainly from birds and fish. But you can see that there, and you know, there's a lot of other things like the ultra-processed foods that has been, you know, identified or named by a Brazilian investigator or dietitian. That's definitely the culture of American food, unless you go to fancy restaurants in San Francisco or New York, which have adapted a more international flavor or twisted to their food items. The culture, the food culture of North America is essentially this type of food. This picture I took in the elevator of a guest house when I was invited to give a talk at the Beth Israel Hospital, one of the Harvard hospitals. So it's owned by Harvard. And this was the advertisement for the restaurant in this guest house. In the guest house, the restaurant served exactly that kind of food. So it shows you how deeply ingrained this is. Even the people that work at a place that's considered the palace of healthy food research, the culture is stronger than the scientific insight. So we talked a lot about the eating habits, and I think for anybody that works in this area, it's a very good idea to take this into consideration when they make recommendations. So some of these cultural influences on food selection have a definite health benefit. Others do not. They basically are more cognitive, mental, spiritual. So that's one thing to keep in mind. In terms of the microbiome, sort of a few general things here. Obviously, you all know there's about 100 trillion of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, archaea in our gut. The gut is the location with the highest density of these microorganisms on the planet. Definitely not the only place, because microbes are everywhere. The body, every epithelial surface is colonized by microbes. And you can go anywhere into the oceans, into the soil, and you find specialized microbiomes in these areas. Just somewhere it has concentrated in the gut, and humans are not the only ones that have that arrangement. Pretty much every animal in evolution, from the earliest forms, I don't know if I have that slide in there, but from the earliest forms of animal life, microbes were in the intestine of these animals and developed over some 1 or 2 billion years a symbiotic relationship with the host. So this is something that you could consider almost it's part of us, but as I'll also emphasize, it has very different properties from our own physiological systems. It's much faster to adapt, and which is part of the problem now that we have this mismatch between the microbes are so good in adapting to new situations or cultural habits. So the fact that cultural determined factors have led to changes in food intake, the microbes can adapt to any of these cultures or religions, or our genes, particularly the genes of the gut-based immune system, don't have this ability to do that. Most important about the gut microbiome is not so we have been mainly concerned in research with the question of who is there, or what are the genera, the taxa, more recently the species and the strains. But what's much more exciting is the number of genes that these microbes have. So you can see that compared to the human genes, several-fold higher amount of genes. We don't know from most of these genes what they do and what they encode. And it's kind of, to me, it's always fascinating that we could develop medical concepts and treatments without taking this into account. So this will definitely has the potential to change the way medicine is both diagnosing but also treating many of our chronic diseases. This is not so important, I think, for acute diseases. You don't need to know this, if you want to find out. Yeah, even though there it's also something of importance. Who is more susceptible to influenza or to HIV or to COVID, where we now know that the microbes do play a role. But it's much more important for understanding chronic diseases and what kind of interventions we need that also are targeted at the microbes. These microbes are not, this microbiome is not assembled in perfection at the time of birth, so there's a big developmental process, which happens really in the first 1,000 days of life. And just illustrated some of the most important ones. There's both the prenatal programming, the health of the mother, the stress of the mother, even antibiotic intake of the pregnant mother. All of these have shown to have an influence on brain development. So it's more the maternal microbiome that's of interest here. Because the fetus does not have a microbiome, but it is accessible, all the metabolites that the mother's microbiome produces. Then there's different ways people come into this world, C-section, vaginal delivery, then the first nutrients, breast milk versus formula feed. And there's also the bombardment with antibiotics. So as soon as somebody comes into this world, prophylactic antibiotics during delivery, in the delivery room, to prevent potential staph infections, have a major effect on this developing once the baby has been born. And on the right side, this postnatal programming. So breast milk is one of those factors, particularly this compound, or these compounds called human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs. Very large molecules cannot be absorbed by the baby's gut, and they're actually they have not developed as nutrients for the infant. They are developed as vehicles to carry signals to the gut, to the developing gut microbiome of the infant. So they will essentially interact with this initially primitive microbiome of the baby, which comes from the mother's birth canal primarily. But these human milk oligosaccharides play a big role in expanding the variety and the richness of this first infant gut microbiome. So essentially, nature does something that is kind of repeated in many ways also in terms of brain development. It programs the baby anticipating what's the best for the adult that this baby will develop into. So that's why it happens all early on in life. it's influenced by a lot of environmental factors. Many of these factors I'm showing here are specific to Western societies. Coming back to the Yanomami, I always tell this story because it was so ingrained in my mind. So once I had to got up in the middle of the night in this shabono, in this living structure, and had to pee. And there was a full moon, and I went into this place. Didn't have any lights with us, obviously, but the full moon showed it. So there was a woman squatting on the floor with a big banana leaf underneath her, and the baby just dropped onto this banana leaf. And you can imagine the exposure to microbes, microbial organisms with this mode of delivery. So all these things that are shown here do not play a role, for example, for the early programming of the microbiome of the Yanomami babies, and it's very true about other cultures around the world as well, in Africa and developing countries. One of the most important, the microbiome has multiple functions, but one of the most important ones is it's an interface between what we put into our gut, shown on the left side, so macronutrients, drugs, chemicals. So in our diet, chemicals, contaminants from the environment are a big portion of it. They come with the water and also with the food, like the pesticides that are, with our modern agriculture. So the microbes then, before this is being absorbed, the microbes pre-process these food items, the ones that make it to the end of the small intestine. So there's a lot of absorption, particularly with our Western food, in the proximal small intestine, in the duodenum. Our modern diet has changed this, that our ancestors, most of the processing happened in the distal gut. Today, almost all the absorption happens in the proximal gut, and we essentially starve our microbiome because very little, we've decreased the fiber intake, decreased the polyphenol intake. So the microbes that produce these health-promoting metabolites do not really get the same amount of nutrition that they used to get. But once the food gets down to areas of the gut that are populated by the microbiome, starting in the ileum, the distal small intestine, and then being highest in the colon. So the metabolites that are being generated interact with receptors in the gut wall. So all the nerves and the endocrine cells and immune cells that are in our gut. So the gut is really the most versatile organ, not just a digestive organ, but that has all these other elements. The biggest part of our immune system, the biggest part of our hormonal system, has its own nervous system, but all these elements have receptors for metabolites of the microbes. So the microbes can talk to any of these systems constantly, and then the information is transported. Some of these effects act on the gut, but a lot of the information in the systemic circulation, the nervous system, like the vagus nerve and the immune system are transported up into the central nervous system and other organs. The schematic of the component that actually makes it to the brain. So there's diet-derived components that microbes process. There's complex polysaccharides, i.e. fiber, polyphenols, amino acids, and also exogenous microbes that we take in with our food, or if you eat fermented foods, you actually ingest quite a bit of exogenous microbes that seem to have a beneficial effect on us. There's also microbe-derived molecules from the cell membrane of the microbes, which is broken down and creates these substances like lipopolysaccharides, or LPS, which is a main inflammatory molecule. Then there's also from de novo. This is something new for our, for our society. All these chemicals or xenobiotics that we're ingesting. The microbes have a tremendous ability with their millions of genes to break down molecules that they've actually never seen before in evolution. Like all these chemicals that we produce or medications, they're all processed and then, and also an interesting thing on the left side, so host-derived molecules, so primary bile acids and sex hormones. So there's a big circular movement of estrogen molecules being glucuronidated in the liver, then excreted into the bile. Most of these glucuronidated estrogens actually are excreted, but a significant amount is processed by the microbes. They remove this molecule with us that prevents it from being reabsorbed. So then all of a sudden the microbes determine how much of the estrogen that's excreted by the liver is excreted and how much is reabsorbed into the systemic circulation. That has a lot of implications, obviously, for postmenopausal syndromes. But since it's not only female sex hormones, but also testosterone, it could have a big potential applications. So a lot of young men, for example, in Brazil, take testosterone supplementations for various reasons. So this could actually have a major effect on how many of testosterone molecules get reabsorbed after they're being metabolized by the liver. So this big gut microbial transformation of what we put into the gut ultimately reaches the brain, and there's just say in summary, there's inflammatory components that reach the brain, and there's anti-inflammatory. The anti-inflammatory, the most important one being these short-chain fatty acids generated from complex carbohydrates or fiber and from polyphenols. So they act as sort of the body's response to any inflammatory substances which are generated by a different group of microbes as well. So it's really the balance of, or the yin and yang between inflammatory and anti-inflammatory molecules that reach the brain after this gut microbial transformation that determines if the brain goes into the direction of neuroinflammation, glial cell activation, and ultimately neurodegeneration. It's not, I always use this example. You can eat something very unhealthy, fat or sugar. If you compensate by eating a very large amount of plant and fiber and fruits, you can compensate for that. So the body has this ability to counteract these inflammatory reactions. And inflammation seems to be now the generally agreed upon mechanism that causes damage from our diet and an unhealthy lifestyle. Not the inflammation that we're used to as physicians that require an antibiotic. It's this metabolic endotoxemia that's generated by an imbalance of these compounds that the microbes produce and then reach our systemic circulation. Another way of looking, how cultural influences and dietary influences, what role they have in this brain-gut microbiome interaction. So I'd like to refer to that system, to this arrangement of brain, microbes, and gut as a complex system rather than an axis, even though the term axis seems to be prevailing. Axis would imply it's a linear, simplistic, reductionistic relationship, but it's not. It's like, as you can see here, this is like a network between what we call now the brain connectome. We're not interested in the individual regions of the brain. We're interested in how they are connected with each other. Same thing about the microbes. We're more and more interested in our analyses of how the microbes interact with each other. It's advanced computational strategies to tease out these relationships. And then we have the gut connectome, which is essentially biggest part of our immune system, biggest part of our nervous system outside the brain, biggest part of our hormonal system. And as you can see here, each of these interact with each other in a bidirectional way. One of the more interesting aspects is that the brain can tell the microbes directly what to do. There's receptors for norepinephrine, for example, on microbes that change their gene expression. But they can also, the brain can also do this indirectly through changing like gut transit and regional transit secretion of antimicrobial peptides. That affects the microbial composition and function as well. The way culture influences the system is really primarily through the brain, because we come up with these models we think is good or bad for us, whereas dietary influences influence us not directly through the brain, indirectly, but primarily targeted at the microbiome and at the gut level. So we talked about the Yanomami many years, decades after we were there and made this film. I attended a lecture at the NIH by a well-known anthropologist and microbiologist, Gloria Dominguez, who is the wife, an equally famous microbiologist, Marty Blazer, and so she did an expedition to this Yanomami some 20 years after we were there. So they were no longer uncontacted. These missions have really played a big role in changing the culture of these people. But what they did is they analyzed their microbiome. I'm surprised that they got stool samples. It would seem a very strange thing to ask these people why you want to have their stool samples. But they managed it, and they found it were very different from diversity and richness from Western samples. And they came to the conclusion, comparing this with other cultures around the world, they had the most diverse and rich microbiome of anybody that has so far been studied. I think the Hastas in Africa come kind of close to it, but it just emphasizes that these remnants of prehistoric cultures have the healthiest gut microbiome adapted to the diet of a very large amount of plant-based foods and sort of this ancestral default diet, where I like to call it. So there have been several studies on vegan, vegetarians, omnivore-oriented, and they came to a conclusion in this study, something that I kind of share nowadays. So their findings suggested that the possibility for a preferential impact of variables other than food, probably related to the general lifestyle. So vegans have a different mindset, a different cultural mindset. They're very strict in what they eat and what they avoid. And I think these non-dietary related components play a major role in determining how the microbiome is made up. It's a small study, so the difficulty with all the studies interpreting microbiome, all the microbiome studies, they all suffered from the same problems. Small sample sizes, differences in collection methods, different in analysis methods, different in computational methods. So it's very difficult to really say, if this study were repeated today, would they come up with the same conclusion? But that's just something we have to live with. I think going forward, there is now mechanisms in place to standardize all these factors. I'm part of a big Alzheimer consortium, NIH Alzheimer consortium with 30 European and US participants, participating universities, and everything is standardized from the collection to the analysis to the computation. and that I think will be a sort of a first, really a breakthrough in understanding differences between people with early cognitive decline, for example, and healthy people. There was this was a meta-analysis came to the same conclusion and questions the universality of the microbiome-based therapeutic strategies and recommended for geographically tailored community-scale approaches to microbiome engineering. So this is a key thing. So microbiome engineering. So you could say, well, this is all interesting, you know, to take culture into consideration is important for dietitians to deal with a diverse population with immigrants from different cultures. Obviously, essential to get the buy-in from these from patients that come from different cultures. But it's also something that's really interesting is this microbiome engineering. I've sort of recently gotten involved with a company that is making biologically engineered microbes from a probiotic, E. coli Nissel, and engineers it in a way that the organisms can thrive in an inflammatory environment, and which normal probiotics do not. So they do not colonize an area of the gut, for example, that is inflamed. And these microbes, they had inserted an operon from a staphylococcus. So pathogens are actually very good in targeting inflamed areas of the gut. So they inserted this operon without changing any other properties. And it has remarkable, so far it's shown remarkable success in mouse studies and also in pig studies. It's actually all the way to the point that this company is now in discussions with the Brazilian veterinarian department in the south of Brazil to do further testing on pig microbiome and how these pigs, many of which also have chronic inflammatory conditions of the gut, how they respond to this intervention. And there will be more. There's a whole, I think the next generation of probiotics will be biologically engineered probiotics. So the take-home message, so hopefully I was able to convince you. I certainly got very excited. Cultural factors play an important but often ignored role in diet and microbiome features. While many cultures share basic similarities in diets conducive to a healthy gut microbiome, such as minimal processed food, few chemicals, low sugar, the standard American diet, the acronym SAD, has introduced extreme, rapid changes on a global level. And this is all important. The changes are extreme from our ancestral diets. They're rapid, have occurred rapidly, and have occurred on a global level because this food, for some reason or other, is popular in many parts of the world that had a much more traditional and healthy diet. And here's the key thing. So the mismatch of the adaptive diet-induced changes in the gut microbiome, I told you it takes about 48 hours to, for example, switch the microbiome of a person on a carnivore diet to one that switches to a vegetarian or vegan diet. So very rapid ability to adapt to this. Our gut cannot do the same thing. It would take it a few thousand years before we can do this adaptation to what's happened in the last 100 years. So there's a mismatch, and the immune cells in the gut perceive this altered microbiome now as a threat and ring the alarm bells. So dendritic cells are being activated and trigger a whole cascade of cytokine production in the gut-associated immune system. And so the big question is, how can you adapt to this? So we can clearly, and you know, anybody involved in dietary interventions is trying to do this, to switch back to more the basic principles of the ancestral diet. I always mention this because I met somebody at the meeting for Fortaleza from Manaus who's studying, forgot her name, unfortunately, who's studying the Amazonian diet, which is also like similar to what I told you about the Yanomami. Basically, predominantly plant-based, meat coming from birds and fish, primarily a small amount of red meat, and none of these other agents that we add to our food. So the adaptation of the modern diet to ancestral dietary patterns are expected to reduce the mismatch in immune activation. We're not going to be able to change our genes anytime soon. We don't want to wait 8,000 years because we'll have died off completely as the human race if this current trend continues, or it becomes totally unaffordable to treat all the diseases that are coming from this current dietary cultural system. But we can't change the diet, and I think there's a lot of discussions about all these what I call fad diets promoted by influencers online, coming up with the next sensational diet every year. That's not where we need to go. We need to really go back to the basic principles of the diets that humans have lived for 95% of the time they have been here on this planet. So thanks for your attention. Any questions that you have, we have to answer.
Bom, thank you very much for the nice speech. We are going to now I invite you to sit, and also Dr. Marcos Zanetti, that's my vice coordinator at the to have some questions to see. Do you have any question?
Alguém gostaria de fazer alguma pergunta dos presentes? Estamos esperando ainda a lista de e-mail. Nós temos as perguntas do e-mail? Oi, não chegou ainda? Acho que ela ia... Quem quer trazer a... So, Emeran, I have one question. I remember you mentioned in the same presentation, but there in Fortaleza, about this, how unexpectedly similar are the impact of sometimes different patterns in the microbiome. I think you mentioned a study that was carried out in Italy between the Parma food dietary habits and Sicily dietary habits. Do you remember it? Was it published or something that you saw in a conference?
Yeah, so I mean, I was invited to talk to, I think it was the Italian Nutrition Society conference in Parma. And Parma is an interesting place because it's the UNESCO heritage site for healthy foods. I don't know how they got this classification, because within Italy it's the unhealthiest food from our current viewpoint. So Parma ham, Parmigiano, and
mortadella,
and a lot of pasta. And actually, to my surprise, one type of pasta, I forgot the name. So if you go to a restaurant, no salad, no vegetables. So I asked first our host, and he said, well, the restaurant food is not necessarily representative for what people eat in their homes. But certainly in the restaurant, it's amazing. You get as an appetizer this big place of cheese and ham. then when you eat this, you basically don't need anything else because it's so. So then it was curious. This has obviously nothing to do with the Mediterranean diet, and so I looked it up, like Sicily, where we've also traveled and eaten. That was much more the classic Mediterranean diet that we think about: lots of seafood, lots of fruits and vegetables, and so the life expectancy is identical. It's about average life expectancy, I think 85 years between Parma and place like Naples, and so that really surprised me. So that you would not see a big effect of this dietary difference. So I can't explain it. Nobody's done a study on it, but I think the one thing that's the same in Parma and Sicily is the lifestyle. In the evening, in these small towns, sitting outdoor in these outdoor restaurants, and families are having meals together, and you see friends and families walking up and down the whole night till midnight, up and down the small cities, the narrow city streets. That's something I've seen in both of these places. So the question is this really the dominant factor of the Mediterranean diet, the lifestyle that goes with it? And I mentioned this a few times. It's definitely a key feature of human evolution with the cooking, that eating became a much more social event, interacting together. And it's something that in the US we've kind of lost, really. A lot of people, I don't know if it's the same here, a lot of people eat while they're commuting to work, stressful environment on the freeway. At the university, first of all, you get very unhealthy meals during lunch, as a lunch in the lectures. But also, to listen to something completely ignoring anything that goes on, or anything that you would associate with a good meal, it's non-existent. If the same thing in France, I've experienced this consulting with Danone, the company. So they make a 1.5 hour lunch break in their scientific meetings, and it's a beautiful 4-course meal in a scientific meeting. So, and the French, we always talk about the French paradox. The actual diet that the French eat is not that healthy based on our criteria, but their lifestyle is obviously, there's many things, particularly social interactions, are very different. So I'm coming more and more. Being a scientist, I always like to come up with these hypotheses, and if the science disproves them, I'm happy to abandon them and come up with a new hypothesis. But right now, I think we have underestimated and undervalued the cultural influence on health, also on healthy longevity. People in the US now are obsessed with healthy longevity. Every meeting.
It's making them more stressed, actually.
Yeah,
they're so concerned.
And so far, I've not seen any results. So, good example that I always look at is I see it in the news when a Holocaust survivor dies in their hundreds, and there's so many examples. And so all the things that we've been teaching and studying is the detrimental effect of early life, diversity of early life experiences on health outcomes, on the microbiome. Well, I guess there's other factors that determine it in Holocaust survivors. Why? And they don't stick with a healthy diet, none of them, or they don't exercise. So it's I think one thing I've learned as a scientist in this area, you really have to be open to alternative explanations of what we experiencing right now with the healthcare crisis and this chronic disease epidemic. There's no easy explanation. I personally find that the systems biological view, where all the elements are connected, all the factors that influence health and healthy longevity. If one of them is altered, for example, if one of these influences is altered, it's quite possible that if the system is resilient, that others compensate for that alteration. It's not that if you eat an unhealthy diet, you necessarily have to die in your 60s. If you do a lot of other things that are and have the right genes, then that shifts you into a pattern that the dietary part will not be the dominant. And some of the studies that are coming out and some of these examples I mentioned to you, they kind of seem to support this. I think what will happen, see this now with AI and the growing popularity of systems biology, that these kind of models, our current models, these linear models, simplistic models, will be replaced, and we'll have a much better predictive ability of, for example, who's gonna die in their 60s and who's gonna live into their hundreds.
Excellent. Perguntas, pessoal. Quem não se sentir confortável em fazer em inglês, pode fazer em português, a gente traduz. You think it might also help us to explain the conflicting data, for instance, on the literature about meat consumption and the impact on gut microbiome? Because really conflicting. So, some studies actually show a possibly positive impact on the microbiota.
Yeah, and with that example, it may not be the meat; it may be the antibiotics and the way these cows. I mean, I know it from working with this company and bioengineered microbiotics. It's shocking to realize, that this weaning stress of piglets being raised in this industrial farming. That this weaning stress causes colitis in, I think, something like 40% of these piglets, and a significant number dies from the colitis. Same true about cows. It's even true about our pets. Our pets, a lot of them have colitis. So we're all experiencing the same kind of thing, these negative health consequences. So, but in terms of red meat, I personally used to eat a lot of red meat. I've kind of abandoned it, not really for health reasons, but for ethical reasons. Particularly now, when I've seen some of these situations, how these animals are raised and how they're not really healthy animals. So, yeah. But it's a good example. We have to be open to this possibility that the meat itself, the protein from meat is actually not the main offender. It's these other things that come along with these, with the high red meat consumption.
So we have a question from our dear friend Carla Tadei, who is recovering from influenza at home. Unfortunately, couldn't be here personally, but she sent this question, Emeran. What's your opinion on clinical microbiome testing to modulate diet based on these tests, and how is this being accepted across the globe?
Can you say it again? Oh, okay. Yeah, so the whole thing about stool microbiome testing and how important this is to inform us or inform physicians and dietitians to recommend special diets. So the stool microbiome testing has gone through different phases. The initial studies were all based on these sequencing. They identified genera, so not even species, and certainly not strains. We have to realize that each genera has multiple species. Some are toxic, others are beneficial. Like E. coli is a good example. And then it goes even further down into strains. So these early tests based on sequencing technologies of at a very high level, I don't think have really any significant value. The field has changed now. that people have, so some of the newer tests, like, Jonah and Tiny Health, for example, they use shotgun metagenomics, so gene express the function of these microbes, which is really the direction that where both the science goes, but also the testing will go. I think you will get some information. I don't think you will necessarily change your dietary recommendations. I think the dietary recommendation should be based on what is this individual eating. So you use a lot of nutrigenomics. Here we have not incorporated this into our recommendations, but I think the simple approach is you do a detailed dietary assessment, and then you make recommendations going back to to this ancestral type of diet, or traditional Mediterranean style diet, and then individuals will have certain food sensitivities to this diet, which I teach them to, with a diary, figure out themselves what consistently gives them symptoms. And many of these will not show consistent effects. Sometimes they have the side effects, sometimes they don't. And then once they've identified these usually not more than a handful of components of the diet, of this Mediterranean diet, then I tell them either to stop it for a while, if they feel better, fine. And then if they really want to eat these types of foods, reintroduce them in a small amount. I would say this works for something like 95% of people. The benefit is also they feel empowered that they actually develop their own diet. It's not a standard recommendation from some consensus conference. It's really their own diet that they have developed, and they can refine even further. There's a few things that we know. We don't have to test them. Dairy, as adults, most adults, with the exception of the Inuits and some Scandinavian people, have lactase deficiency, because it sort of, the levels of lactase drop after the first 3 years, and we have the lactase basically that for the optimal infant nutrition, but then we don't, as adults, we don't really need it. So that's something, unless somebody loves, milk, unfermented milk, dairy products, I tell most people that's something that should start with eliminating this. And yeah, fermented dairy products then is definitely something that does some of the work that normally the microbes would have done. Do this externally. But in general, the specificity of making recommendations based on a stool test, I personally don't think that that's necessary. If people want to follow their success in their dietary improvement, and you do serial stool tests, and you see there's an increase in butyrate producers, or an increase in butyrate gene expression, then that's a different story. So to get feedback for the patient if what they're doing actually has a biological effect, not just a subjective effect.
Okay.
I was sort of curious how many people in the room are involved in the dietary consulting area, and how you use how you use stool tests. That's, shake your head, Well, if you wait for the mic.
I have one question, not related to the using the microbiome sequencing in the clinics. What do you consider that is a change in the microbiome or an alteration? Because we know that, let's say we are when we analyze the data, we have several species. We have alpha diversity, like several matrices, and also several matrices for beta diversity. And if we associate this with when like several exposure variables, we may find a positive or an inverse or a direct and or indirect association with statistical significance. But what do you would say that is a real change when we consider species or genera changes associated with the diversity or associated with an outcome also?
Yeah, can you just ask this again? Hold your microphone a little bit closer to you.
Okay. Let me try in another way. As when we analyze the microbiome, we have several variables. So, which one would be you would say that is the best to say that is a real change in the microbiome?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, if you do the normal sequencing, then yeah, I mean, obviously you want to look for the good microbes, and so there's different ways. One is diversity, alpha and beta diversity, and richness, which is sort of the general. They often do not necessarily change, but then the relative ratios of good bacteria, which are in general butyrate producers, and those that are involved in some of the unhealthy metabolites. That's generally what I would recommend. But it's I mean, ultimately the main thing that you want to know is how many inflammatory or anti-inflammatory metabolites are being produced, and if that proportion is low, you will know it puts you at a risk of having chronic inflammatory conditions in the brain, but also somewhere else. I think it's kind of a simple. In the future, using AI to look at patterns, it's certainly happening now. That people are doing this. That will give you a more granular answer to your question. But I think right now, the most consistent, the most consistent pattern, or most predictive pattern that I've seen is, in addition to the basic ones, diversity and richness, to get the proportion of anti-inflammatory metabolite producing microbes. I think that's
okay. So associate with a function, not like only a change in one microbe, but if this microbe has an important function to the host system.
Yeah, and it's not just one microbe. You have multiple microbes that produce short chain fatty acids. Yeah. So you may lose one of those microbes and will have no effect on the overall pattern. But if you lose a whole group of them, then that will decrease, the amount of butyrate that's in the systemic circulation. And when I say butyrate, I mean, it's also oversimplified. In the future, we'll find probably other molecules that are possibly equally important in the anti-inflammatory effects. I mean, I like this yin and yang model because if you look at this at the brain, the influence that neurons are exposed to is always it's LPS, it's other membrane fragment components, microbial components that stimulate cytokines, and on the other side, there's always the anti-inflammatory component of butyrate. So you may produce a lot of these membrane fragments that are LPS-like activity, but if you have enough of the anti-inflammatory ones, it won't create any symptoms, or will not move your brain towards neurodegeneration. So I think some of these more complex models that you don't just go for one microbe, one molecule, one metabolite. I think it's just not going to that doesn't reflect the complexity of that system.
Thank you.
And it's very different from the pathogens. You know, you need only one pathogen and one strain of that pathogen, like E. coli, enterotoxic E. coli. That is bad no matter what. You know, but that's not how the rest of the microbiome works. It's how pathogens work, and where microbiology has been really good in identifying those. But it's a totally different mechanism that how the microbiome is involved in health and these chronic diseases.
Today we don't have a consensus or a definition of what a healthy microbiome might be, and it's, of course, that's challenging for both, I believe, both research and clinical purposes. Is there any society that is developing or proposing a standardized criteria or a pipeline to evolve to a criteria to a better definition of what a healthy microbiome or microbiota?
Yeah, so that
like?
question, it's a good question. It's not being asked that often anymore, because I think people have kind of accepted the idea there's not one healthy microbiome. You know, there's healthy microbiome for people living in Nigeria, and another one for people living in the North Pole and living in Brazil. And they reflect the adaptation of these populations to their environment and their geographic locations. Certainly, you know, what we call a healthy microbiome, like the control in many studies done in the US, it's not really a healthy microbiome. It's already affected by the unhealthy lifestyle that the majority of people in the US are exposed to. So that's another big question. You know, what do you compare your findings to, like in Alzheimer's or in you know, and you may come up with totally different conclusions. So, you know, people always think with increasing age of the population, there will be this necessary increase in Alzheimer's disease. But that's not really supported. There's a lot of people in their 90s and even hundreds with full cognitive abilities. And so, I mean, I think in that population, and there's several questions, is that reflected in their gut microbiome? Are those, and there are studies, the centenarians, you know, does their gut microbiome look like? This was originally done in these blue zones that, you know, people suspected there's regions on the planet where people have the longest life expectancy, but in the meantime, these pockets of centenarians have popped up everywhere in the world. Even people that don't live in these blue zones, that do not do all the healthy lifestyle things, like in I think in Italy there's a strong increase in their population. I think also in China, and these are not necessarily people that have done all the good things for the microbiome. So we have not. I don't think we have developed a consensus of, you know, how to reconcile the diet, the lifestyle, the microbiome, and the health consequences. I think we have sort of general guidelines, but in terms of a healthy microbiome as a comparator, that's difficult. Would you use the Yanomami as a healthy microbiome? They have the healthiest, objectively, the healthiest microbiome, but it's not constant. The moment, you know, when they are moved to westernized villages and diet, that advantage disappears. The microbiome is no longer the healthiest. So it's do we want to compare populations in the US with the Yanomami microbiome? I don't think that's a good comparison, because they, you know, so there's a lot of these unanswered questions.
Thanks for the presentation. My name is Emilia. I'm from Faculty of Pharmaceutical Science at USP. And I'm very interested in the study that shows that the microbial diversity of Yanomami indigenous is higher. Could be this related to the consumption of more natural and fermented food?
Well, I personally think the reason for this optimal microbiome that they have is their lifestyle. So it's the diet, number one. It's the physical exercise. I mean, both men and women are basically physically active all day long. It's the social cohesion. So looking at these pictures in retrospect, 40 years later, it's amazing the interactions in the family between the children and even the fathers who go to war every month or so, how close they are to their children and how they eat together. So, yeah, I mean, we can follow all these guidelines. We can't do it as extreme as the Yanomami do, but the social interactions, the physical exercise, the largely plant-based diet. So they do all the things I think that we should recommend, our patients as well, in a form that's adapted to, to Western, to our society that we live in. But it's definitely not something that protects them. So there were examples. I always try to meet this person, but so there was a very famous anthropologist who led an expedition in the 60s, I think, to the Yanomami, the French name, and one of his PhDs fell in love with one of the local women, and then they had children together, but then they decided to move back to Philadelphia with his family. The wife could not stay in Philadelphia, just could not tolerate the lifestyle, but the children did. But they all had the same health problems as people that have always been in Philadelphia. So having this programmed healthy microbiome did not protect them from developing obesity and diabetes, and goes a little bit against this early life programming that I mentioned, but clearly with the Yanomami, and look at Native Americans, for example, they all suffer from obesity, diabetes, all the chronic diseases that the Native American lifestyle was kind of similar for the Yanomami, really, as lots of physical exercise, a healthy diet, lots of social interactions.
It's great. One last question. Uma última pergunta. Betty, quer falar algo?
I was wondering, Dr. Emeran, if we go into putting more bioactive substance in our diet, would you expect to get an improvement in the quality of the diet and as well as the microbiome?
If we change our
Yes,
diet?
if we could make some shifts.
Yeah, for the majority of people, I think that's definitely the most straightforward approach. Like you can't teach people that live in big cities to live in social isolation. I mean, that's sort of another factor. Social isolation is not a big thing. Supposedly has epidemic proportions. So this whole eating together, living together is kind of something that's disappearing. But so the diet is something I think that is in some ways seemingly the simplest thing. How much you can change these dietary habits in people that have lived unhealthy all their lives is another question. I think what this Nora Torres does with this Eat Real, going into the youngest population and changing the cafeteria food, and then through this learning process teach the parents, and the parents see that their children are healthier. to me, that is one of the more realistic and practical approaches. If the government does it, it's always going to be a political resistance. So when Michelle Obama tried to do this, several years ago, it was killed because of politics. People would not do it because if you were not a Democrat, you would reject what she was saying. Same if when the mayor of New York started this initiative to remove the big bottles with sugary drinks. It was basically killed for political reasons, that initiative. So I think in our polarized societies, it has to come from within, community efforts, and I think directives or recommendations coming from above are not going to be that helpful. It's sort of my impression.
It's a pity that it goes to this way, but it's nice. Well, there's someone has. Oh, you have a question. Thank you.
What do you think about probiotics and postbiotics supplementation?
Yeah, so this is a very common question. So typically the question is, which probiotic do you recommend? Then it's a different thing. But I think the conventional probiotic supplements, they do work for some people. So virtually 90% of patients that come to see me, they're already taking a probiotic. And so my question is always, do you think it's beneficial for you? Has it helped you? Do you feel better? Is your digestion better? If they say yes, I say, yeah, you should stay on it. Don't experiment with anything else. If they're not sure, which is, I would say, at least half of the people, then I tell them you may want to stop it for a while and see what happens. If there's no significant change, that probiotic didn't really do much for you. And you may want to try increase your variety of naturally fermented foods. So there's lots of clinical trials on probiotics. I think the few that are positive are in children. There's some that show that after an antibiotic treatment, there's an improved recolonization of the gut, even though there's other evidence, pretty strong evidence from investigators at the Weizmann Institute in Tel Aviv that show the opposite, that it takes longer if you take a probiotic for the microbes to come back after antibiotic. I'm not sure if this has really been settled. And this whole field, so I mean, I've been involved with Danone and doing several clinical trials on their Activia yogurt, and the goal was to show that it works in IBS, for example, in irritable bowel syndrome, and we could not show that. We could show that it helps for minor digestive discomfort, like bloating and gurgling, and but not for IBS in general. So, as I said earlier, I think the big time for probiotics will come with these modified probiotics, which can do very specific functions. This could work for, for example, this estrogen recycling. This is another, at our center, somebody works on this, to use engineered probiotics to enhance the recycling of estrogen. And I mean, I'm not generally a fan of genetic engineering or genetic modifications, but when you think about what the problem is that so the microbes have adapted rapidly to our lifestyle, but they're mismatched with our gut. So, and it's not going to solve itself easily without an intervention. So if you can alter the microbiome in a way that this mismatch is less, there's less inflammation in the gut, that would be a huge, and so this company that I'm working with, that's one of the future plans. So initially it's for inflammatory bowel disease, but the next stage is, can you actually influence this mismatch between microbes and the gut immune system to decrease this low-grade inflammation? So simple answer, currently available probiotics, supplements, if they work for you, continue taking them. I think it's better, greater variety of organisms, and probably better studies to show that naturally fermented foods, particular variety, gives you a greater variety of these organisms. And the future looks very exciting, but if they will take 5 years or 10 years, I don't know. Yeah.
One more question.
Professor, since you mentioned IBS, I see everyone's talking about SIBO right now. I'd like to know if there's a protocol for SIBO.
Yeah, so I'm not the right person to talk about SIBO because I don't really believe it as a diagnosis. Not the way it's used currently. So when I was in medical training, we saw the rare patients with SIBO. So these were people that have compromised motility, gut motility, connective tissue disease, post-gastric surgery, post-vagotomy. So a major change in the transit of food through the gut, which will predispose you that microbes, who live in the small intestine, but in low concentrations, that they migrate further up and that more from the colon actually colonize the small intestine. But this was a very small group of people and they had very distinct symptoms, not just bloating. I mean, they had diarrhea, malabsorption, pretty serious symptoms. And so that, I think, is SIBO, the real SIBO. Based on the breast tests, highly questionable. I think a lot of experts, there was just a recent opinion paper review article by the leading people in IBS, microbiome, and they basically said that neither the tests are able to diagnose SIBO, nor has there been any evidence that treating SIBO with antibiotics is an effective therapy for IBS. Everybody gets better on an antibiotic because it decreases bacteria in your colon as well. As a fraction of these bacteria produce gas in their metabolism. And if you suppress that gas production, there's less distension of the small intestine or the colon. And then you have fewer symptoms of bloating in IBS. So I'm glad there's a big controversy right now in the US. When this article came out, there were threats to the publishers and that this was a biased review. And I'm not sure if it's settled down by now, but I'm glad to see that some of the leading voices basically have the same opinion that I've had for a long time, that it's not something we need to worry about in IBS treatment or diagnosis. And also, like one thing, I have some insights. The people behind that movement, the whole SIBO and breath testing, so they are our neighbors in LA at Cedars-Sinai Hospital, and I personally think it's unethical behavior what they've done, and how much money has been made by them. So this is all driven by profit. There's a huge amount of money being made in this industry. With the antibiotic and with the breast tests, hospitals like it because now they can make money on an IBS patients. So I'm usually not a good person to ask these questions. Same with the low FODMAP diet, because I don't have the same opinion as some of the professional organizations. And that started early in my career when we promoted the brain-gut model for IBS some 30 years ago, and it was rejected to everybody by the the Rome Foundation and all my colleagues and industry. I still remember some of these meetings with industry. They would always say, well, Dr. Mayer, keep in mind, IBS is a gut disease. It's not a brain-gut disorder. And so now all of a sudden, the Rome Foundation accepted it. Now everybody says, oh, it's a brain-gut disorder. You know, it's an interesting field, I have to say. It's,
Well,
hopefully that answered your question.
well, is there any question? You see, we are coming to the end, and I want to thank you all for being here with us, making this moment unique. I want to thank again Dr. Emeran. I want to thank for all this knowledge and sharing with us, and also Dr. Marcos Zanetti, that's our vice coordinator, that help us a lot bringing knowledge to the group. Thank you.
Maybe one word I was going to say, it's been wonderful to have this connection to the Brazilian community. You know, it's been it's been in many ways a very unique experience, both in terms of the scientific conversations I've had with Marcus and some of you, but also the entire experience coming to a meeting in Brazil is really a special, unique experience, I have to say, socially and professionally.
We are glad to hear that, Emeran. Thanks a lot for being here with us and accept the invitation. We know it's a long flight, and Brazil is not the, let's say, the smoothest country for foreign visitors, and we really appreciate your time and sharing all this knowledge with us. Thanks a lot.